So the origin of Hindu belief is deeply rooted in the environmental factors in the Indian subcontinent itself. And it's easy to see this when you travel there because the environmental factors are way more an element in everyday life, meaning they're both people that live outside a lot more. Their culture is much more based in direct relationship with nature, and has been all the way up until the relatively late industrialization of India in the 20th century. But most importantly, there is also a huge range of different environments in India. So if you look at the Indian subcontinent from the top down, you have the largest mountains in the world, the Himalayas in the very north. Below that, you have massive foothills that lead into high jungle areas that lead down into the high plains of northern India. That large northern plain of India will be an area that will be contested through most of modern history by various tribes and peoples fighting for conquest. As you move further south, you move into areas of desert, extreme desert conditions, which are almost uninhabitable in places. Other spots, which as you move further south, as you can see along that southwest border, areas that are again jungle, and then through the center you have high mountain areas, which is where the British settled, which are quite pleasant, a little bit like the environment of England. It's rainy, temperate, and then down all the way to Sri Lanka, which is really a jungle area. So huge range of natural settings, which speaks perhaps to the range of gods and also the range of beliefs in this area that are going to consolidate into Hinduism. So just to look at the languages that are spoken in India, there are many of them. Hindi is the primary language of the north, and Tamil is the language of the south. There are lots of different sub-dialects there, and so even the linguistic structure is complicated and diverse. If you look at how India gets settled, the Indo-Europeans or the Aryans in the north, we'll talk more about them in a minute. Generally, the people of northern India are a little lighter skinned. The Dravidians in the south, relatives of the original pre-Aryan Indian people, have again more concentrated in the south. So you still have a little bit of this division in India. So let's come back to this question of how environment might shape belief. If you look at India, India is a land of extremes. So in the summer months, it routinely gets up to 100, 120 degrees. The desert areas are absolutely brutal. You can see here sidewalks melt. In the middle of the day, India becomes basically goes to a standstill for the people who are outside. It's extremely brutal. So extremes of heat, and obviously also famously extremes of rain. So the monsoon, which impacts the whole continent, will result in absolutely devastating and torrential rains. And these rains come in part from something called the katabatic wind cycle. You may have learned about this freshman year in earth science, but basically the katabatic winds are high velocity, high density winds that blow down from the Tibetan frontier south. So what happens is as the continent warms up and as the heat over the land develops and the air rises, you begin to get systems of low pressure. And as the water and the oceans remain a little bit cooler, that high pressure begins to get driven up, and clouds begin to form, and those clouds get swept up. And as they get swept up, they pick up the water from the ocean and rise up towards that Tibetan plain, towards the mountains. And as the water gets pulled in with the clouds, eventually it becomes oversaturated. And essentially what you're seeing in the monsoon is the entire area of the ocean basically being dropped on land. I mean, it's a kind of rain that if you haven't experienced before, it's a little bit like what you see in the heart of a hurricane. It's just basically buckets of rain. So if you combine this intense heat with the rain, also quite a lot of earthquakes in that area because of the two plates coming together in the Himalayan plateau, you have a lot of things that people are afraid of, devastation in a lot of different forms. So it's interesting to think about this because the fundamental philosophy of Hinduism and the idea of Maya, which is central to the Upanishads' idea of the nature of reality, and basically for Hindus, Maya is the nature of illusion. So the world around them is a world that doesn't speak to the higher truth. So they look for truths above the material world. This is very different from the Abrahamic religions, where God gives man dominion over the earth, and the earth, the meaning of God and God's creation can be found in the world around you. So you search for meaning in your world. For India, you search for meaning in yourself and beyond your world. And even in yourself, the avidya, the illusion of self, this idea that looking into yourself, you're not going to find the truth immediately. You have to go to a deeper level. Some people think that this is a byproduct of a world where monsoon rains and hurricanes and they're called typhoons over there, heat, all these things generate this idea that the world can't be trusted in the same way. So there's a very different philosophy about the relationship of human beings to their environment. Now, the earliest form of civilization was the Dravidian culture of Mohenjo-Daro. And Mohenjo-Daro was a river valley civilization that emerges in the area in Pakistan around the Indus River during the Neolithic period, so about 3,300 BCE to about 1500 BCE. And as you can see here, the Harappan River civilization involves the growth of a relatively large city, Mohenjo-Daro, which was defined by pretty remarkable urban planning. There was an advanced water system, and water seemed to be at the center of their center of worship too. There were ritual pools, and it's interesting, from a very, very early stage, even pre-Aryan invasion, water was central to the culture itself. And historians think it also impacted the religious belief system too. The other thing that's interesting to look at is one of the figurines from the Harappan River civilization. The dancing girl shows that dance and movement was very important to the Indian people as well. And this, again, probably 15 young adolescent girl dancing is fascinating because, number one, we know that dance was important. A way of celebrating the gods or celebrating religion in some way, and also shows the power of self-possessed women. And you're going to see this in other aspects of early Indian and Dravidian culture. So it's worth noting that. So if you look at this area called Harappa, which and Mohenjo-Daro, this part of the same civilization, this was the Neolithic civilization that emerged in that period. Now, what happened at the end of that period, whether it was due to droughts, which may have driven the people of Harappa further south, or whether it was because of the Aryan invasions themselves, which happened right about 1500 BCE, there was a large influx from Central Asia. And this is interesting because the Aryans were the same people who historians believe settled in Europe as well. So there's kind of a unifying factor. The Aryans went both into Europe and into what's now Persia and into India. And what's fascinating about this is the idea that the Aryans basically formulated what Hinduism was, which corresponded to the British colonization of India. And of course, there are a lot of Indians that think, well, isn't that convenient? You know, here come these British people that think that the origin of our entire civilization is based on the only thing in our history which really has any connection to Europe, which is the Aryans. And I think what's fascinating about it is it's absolutely true that it's the Aryan and Dravidians together that form this civilization. But the Indians look at it much more in a much more complex way. It's not just the Aryans; it's also the Dravidians. So the Aryans bring in their religious beliefs. They bring in their language, which is Sanskrit, which is going to be the language of the Upanishads and the language of the holy texts of Hinduism. So if you look at how all of this comes together, ultimately, India is a Hindu country and a Hindu culture. If you look at that blue area, the majority religion in India is Hindu. There's a little bit of Christianity in Bangladesh and Bengal, and there is Buddhism around the edges, but really it is primarily Hindu. If you look at the minority religions there, you're going to see there's some Buddhism there, some Jainism, Sikhism, and these are all going to be subsets of Hinduism in the sense they're going to be pulled back into Hinduism through the inclusive idea of the Dharma. Now, earlier we saw the dancing girls. One of the things that's interesting about what comes out of early Hinduism is the Yashinis. And the Yashinis are fertility symbols, and you see these in the Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions. And it's interesting because unlike some of the other symbols of female fertility, they're also a little bit more sexual and a little bit more enticing in a traditional way than some of the other early forms of female power. And so the divine feminine in Hinduism is quite strong. It's quite self-assertive. You don't see this kind of symbolism in Abrahamic religions or really much elsewhere in the world. The other interesting thing about this is you see early on, and I think I showed you this earlier when we were looking at the Neolithic Revolution, is you also see in Mohenjo-Daro strong evidence that the yogas, which are the internal practices, the spiritual practices, were well developed even before formal religious doctrine emerged. So whether it was dancing or whether it was sitting meditation, various mindfulness techniques, it's pretty clear that these were part of the religion, as was, if you look carefully at this, forms of animism, connection between people and the natural world. So if you go back and you look at these kind of violent extremes which classify which characterize the continent, you'll see these also reflected in the early Aryan gods, the early Hindu gods. Rudra, who is the roarer or the howler, the god of destruction. He comes a little bit before Shiva does, but this whole idea that there is a roaring, howling, almost like a wind-like god. These katabatic winds embodied in this particular god form. Indra, the god of heaven, the ruler of all that is good, reflects the Aryan importance of the warriors. And then Agni, the god of fire and sacrifice, also will be extremely important in this, that fire and sacrifice will be central to what Hinduism is. So the Aryans, who were lighter-skinned people, settled in the north. The Dravidian people, who were darker-skinned people, settled in the south. And the caste system also is going to develop around that. One last element of early Hinduism is the story of Purusha. And Purusha speaks to this very early idea of what Hinduism is. So Purusha is the primal man, a divine being or a cosmic giant who exists before time begins. And so he splits up and he explodes and spreads out in all directions and creates all the other gods in the universe itself. So all the spiritual beings, everything comes from within this primal man, which is interesting if you know the idea of a macrocosm and microcosm. He is the macrocosm. He is the entire universe, and that is within him the microcosm. It's the small world within himself, and that's a metaphor for our internal being. We are both the entire universe in ourselves. And that's the whole idea of Hinduism, is to find that large being within yourself. but the idea of sacrifice being critical to everything that's at the core of Hinduism. So I'll leave you with that. I want you to think about how environment might impact Hinduism in key ways, and to write a little something that speaks to the fundamental aspects of this.